He never showed up. That was the part that broke something in Evelyn Ashcroft. Not the long train ride across half the country, not the single worn suitcase she'd packed with what remained of her life, and not even the cruel laughter she heard rippling across the platform at Blackstone Station when she stepped off that train at 56 years old, dressed in her best blue wool coat, believing a man had chosen her. No. What broke her was learning that Raymond Hollis had sold the ranch 3 weeks earlier, pocketed the money, and disappeared without sending a single word. Not a letter. Not a telegram. Not even the common decency of a lie. He just left her standing there. If this story made you feel something already, hit that like button right now, drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what happens to Evelyn Ashcroft on that platform is only the beginning. The afternoon train had pulled away from Blackstone Station at 20 minutes past 3, and by 4 o'clock, Evelyn was still standing on the same stretch of weathered platform where it had left her. She hadn't moved much. She'd set her suitcase down beside the bench near the east wall of the depot building, straightened it so it stood parallel to the bench leg, and then stood beside it with her hands folded in front of her coat, watching the road that led into town, watching for a wagon, watching for a man she'd only seen in a small photograph tucked into the first letter he'd sent her 7 months ago. The photograph showed a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s standing beside a fence post, squinting slightly against afternoon sun. He had an honest face, she'd thought, the kind that had been worked on by weather and years. She'd kept that photograph in the inside pocket of her traveling bag, and she'd looked at it more times than she would ever admit during the 3-day train ride from Ohio. The road into Blackstone stayed empty. Around her, the small drama of a frontier depot continued without concern for her situation. A freight handler rolled a cart of crates toward the warehouse. 2 cowboys leaned against the far railing, watching her with the casual curiosity of men who had nothing better to do. A woman in a gray dress hurried past with a child by the hand, glanced at Evelyn, and looked away quickly with the specific discomfort of someone who has recognized another person's trouble and decided it isn't theirs to enter. Evelyn noticed all of it. She was good at noticing things without appearing to. She'd had a lot of practice. At 56, Evelyn Margaret Ashcroft had outlasted 2 difficult decades in a small Ohio town, a marriage that had ended not in divorce, but in the slow erosion of 2 people who had stopped being honest with each other long before the funeral. She had kept a house, raised a daughter who now lived in Boston with her own family and her own life, worked as a seamstress and then as a bookkeeper for a dry goods store whose owner treated her with polite disregard. She had answered Raymond Hollis's correspondence advertisement in a Frontier Gazette because she had looked at the life she was living and understood, with the particular clarity that comes at 56, that waiting for something to change on its own was the same as choosing nothing. So she had chosen something, and that something had not shown up. One of the cowboys near the railing said something she couldn't quite hear, and the other one laughed. She didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on the road. By 4:30, the station master came out of the depot office. He was a thin man in his 40s named Harold Briggs, with a mustache that he kept neat and eyes that had seen enough frontier hardship to have developed a permanent quality of mild apology. He walked toward her with the specific gait of a man approaching a difficult conversation. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Briggs," she said, because he'd introduced himself when she'd arrived and asked about Raymond Hollis, and he'd told her to wait, that ranchers sometimes ran late. Harold Briggs stood beside her and looked at the road for a moment, as though hoping the wagon might appear while he gathered himself. "I've been making some inquiries," he said finally. "I should have told you sooner. I apologize for that." "Told me what?" He cleared his throat. "Raymond Hollis sold his property, the Anchor H Ranch over on the Eastern Ridge. He sold it approximately 3 weeks ago to a land speculation company out of Denver. Then he left town." He paused. "Nobody here knows where he went." Evelyn heard the words, she understood each one individually, and she understood them together. She kept looking at the road because she didn't want to look at Harold Briggs's face right now, which wore the expression of a decent man who felt genuinely sorry and genuinely helpless. "He didn't leave a message," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No, ma'am, not that anyone's told me." She nodded slowly. Her hands, still folded in front of her coat, tightened briefly against each other and then relaxed. "What day does the next eastbound train come through?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow, 8 in the morning." She nodded again. "Is there somewhere I can wait? A hotel?" Harold Briggs' expression shifted slightly. "There's the Cattleman's Rest on Main Street. Mrs. Aldrich runs it." He hesitated. It's not... It's a working-class establishment, ma'am. Nothing fancy." "I'm not looking for fancy." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated again. "Thing is, a room there costs 75 cents a night. With meals, it's more." Another pause. "If money is a concern, and I don't mean to presume, there's a cot in the back of the depot office. Nobody uses it overnight. You'd have privacy, and it doesn't cost anything." The two cowboys at the railing were watching again. She could feel it without looking. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think on it." Harold Briggs nodded and went back inside, leaving her alone again with the empty road and the cooling afternoon air and the low sound of the two cowboys resuming their conversation. She heard the word bride in it. That word, and a sound that followed it. Evelyn Ashcroft had not cried in public since she was 9 years old. She had no intention of changing that record today. She picked up her suitcase, carried it to the bench, and sat down. The calculation was straightforward. She had $14.30 in the inside pocket of her traveling bag. She had the return train fare. She'd bought a round-trip ticket in Ohio because her daughter had insisted on it, with the particular worried practicality of a younger woman who loves her mother but doesn't quite believe in her judgment. The ticket would take her back to Cincinnati. What waited for her in Cincinnati was the spare room in her daughter's cousin's house, which had been offered in the way that spare rooms are sometimes offered, with genuine kindness but a quiet understanding that it was temporary. She had been so certain she wouldn't need that room. She heard boots on the platform boards and looked up, expecting Harold Briggs again. It wasn't Harold Briggs. The man who stopped a few feet from her bench was somewhere in his mid-40s, she guessed. The weather and work had complicated the arithmetic. He was built the way men who'd spent their lives on horseback were built. Lean through the middle, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of posture that came not from effort, but from years of having to hold a position. He wore a gray work shirt and trail-worn trousers, and his hat was pushed back slightly on his head, the way men pushed it back when they weren't sure what they were about to say. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was even, not unkind. "I don't mean to intrude." "Then don't," she said. It came out more sharply than she intended. He absorbed it without flinching. "Fair enough," he said. He stayed where he was, which surprised her. Most men, receiving that tone, would have tipped their hat and retreated. "I'm Colt Brennan," he said. "I've got a cattle operation about 6 miles north of here. I was in town picking up feed, and I saw you come off the afternoon train." "I imagine most people on this platform did," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I did." He was quiet for a moment. "I also heard what Harold told you." She looked at him directly for the first time. He met her gaze without the apologetic sliding away she'd been getting from everyone else. "And?" she said. "And I thought you handled it well." That was not what she'd expected him to say. She didn't respond. "I don't mean that as flattery," he said. "I mean it as an observation. I've seen men get worse news than that and fall apart considerably faster." "I haven't fallen apart," she said. "I'm sitting on a bench." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm talking about." She studied him. He wasn't performing sympathy, which she'd been receiving in small doses since she stepped off the train, and which she found, if she was being honest with herself, far more difficult to tolerate than the open laughter. "What is it you want, Mr. Brennan?" she asked. He turned his hat in his hands once, a gesture that looked habitual rather than nervous. "I've got a ranch that's about 2 people short of being properly managed," he said. "It's not a comfortable situation. The house is plain. The work is hard and there's a lot of it. But if you need a place to stay while you figure out what comes next, I've got a room that isn't being used and meals that don't cost you anything." She stared at him. "I'm not asking for anything in return," he said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not Raymond Hollis." "That is an extremely low bar," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Yes, ma'am. I suppose it is." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the road that led into town and passed it to the horizon where the afternoon train had gone. Then she looked back at Colt Brennan. "You don't know me," she said. "I could be anyone." "You could," he agreed. "I've been wrong before. Why would you offer this to a stranger?" He was quiet for a beat. "Because I've been on the other end of a situation where somebody could have offered help and didn't," he said. "And I've thought about it a long time since then." He didn't elaborate. She didn't push him. "I'll think on it tonight," she said. "I have until the morning." "All right." He reached into his vest pocket and handed her a small folded piece of paper. "That's where the ranch is, in case you decide yes. I'll be coming through town at first light to pick up a lumber order. If you want a ride, I'll be at the hardware store on Mill Street at 6. She took the paper. "And if I don't want a ride?" "Then I'll pick up my lumber and head back," he said simply. "No hard feelings either way." He put his hat back on, touched the brim once, and walked off down the platform. Evelyn watched him go. Then she unfolded the piece of paper and looked at the rough directions he'd written in a hand that was practical and unornamental. 6 miles north, turn at the split cottonwood, follow the fence line to the second gate. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She spent the night on the cot in the back of Harold Briggs's depot office, which he offered again before locking up, and she accepted this time because $14.30 was $14.30. The cot was narrow, and the blanket smelled of kerosene, and the depot building made the kinds of noises old wood makes when the temperature drops. But she'd slept in worse places during the first years of her marriage, when money was a problem they hadn't yet learned to manage. She lay in the dark and thought about the situation the way she used to think through problems at the dry goods store, methodically, without sentiment, turning it over to look at each face of it. Going back to Ohio meant the spare room and the polite faces, and the specific silence of people who loved her but didn't know what to do with a woman her age, who had tried something bold and failed publicly. It meant watching her daughter try not to say "I told you so," and trying not to see the effort it cost her. Going to this man's ranch meant what exactly? She didn't know him. She had read him for approximately 4 minutes on a train platform in failing afternoon light. He could be anything. Men in the West could be anything. But she'd read people for 56 years, and she knew something about the way they held themselves when they were performing kindness versus when they simply were it. Harold Briggs had performed it, warmly and genuinely, but performed it. The two cowboys had performed cruelty for each other's benefit. Colt Brennan hadn't performed anything. He'd said what he meant and left the choice with her. She fell asleep sometime before midnight with the paper still in her coat pocket, and when she woke before dawn, she didn't lie there reconsidering, and when sobbed. She got up, straightened the cot, gathered her suitcase, and walked to Mill Street. The sky was still dark purple at the edges when she got there. The hardware store was dark, but Colt's wagon was already hitched to the post outside it, the horse standing patient and still in the cold morning air, its breath making small clouds. Colt came around the corner from the back of the store, carrying a length of lumber on his shoulder, and stopped when he saw her standing on the boardwalk. "Morning," he said. The word was quiet and matter-of-fact, as though he had not been uncertain whether she would come. "Morning," she said. He loaded the lumber without asking for help, and when he was done, he came and took her suitcase from her hand without comment and put it in the wagon bed. Then he climbed up to the driver's bench and waited. She climbed up beside him. They rode out of Blackstone in the gray light before sunrise without saying much of anything. The town fell away behind them. The road north opened up through grassland that was still brown with the end of winter, the sky going from purple to gray to the pale, thin blue of early morning. After about 20 minutes, he said, "You drink coffee?" "Yes." "Good. I make it strong." "So do I," she said. He nodded as though this settled something. They rode another mile in silence, and then he said, "I should tell you what you're getting into. The ranch has about 240 head of cattle right now. There's a bunkhouse for the hands. I've got 2, Denny Marsh and a kid named Tobe who's been with me since last spring. The main house is separate. You'd have the room off the back hallway. There's a bolt on the door." "All right," she said. "The water pump is behind the house. The kitchen stove needs coaxing in the morning. You have to bank it right, or it smokes. I can show you." "I've worked with worse stoves," she said. I believe you. He glanced at her once and looked back at the road. What did you do before you came out here? Seamstress first, then bookkeeping. You kept books? For 11 years. Payroll, accounts receivable, inventory. He absorbed this. The ranch finances are a mess, he said. It didn't sound like a complaint. It sounded like a fact being placed on a table. I imagine they are, she said. I'm good with cattle, he said. I'm not good with numbers. Most people aren't. Are you good with livestock? She considered honestly. I've handled horses. I grew up with them. Cattle less so, but I learned quickly. He nodded again. The wagon moved through the pale morning, and the cold air smelled of frost and dry grass, and somewhere ahead, wood smoke. Mr. Brennan, she said. Colt, he said. Colt. She paused. Why does your ranch need 2 people? A beat of silence. The horse's hooves on the road. The creak of the wagon. My wife left 2 years ago, he said. His voice didn't change. She went back to her family in Kansas. The ranch was too isolated, she said. Too much work and not enough of anything else. He looked straight ahead. She wasn't wrong about the isolation. And the work? There's a lot of it, he said. I told you that. You did, she said. I don't mind work. I know, he said. That's part of why I asked. They came around a long bend in the road, and the ranch came into view. A main house built of timber and stone, functional and plainly constructed, with a barn beyond it, and a string of fence line running north into the distance. Thin smoke rose from the house chimney. From the barn she could hear the low sound of cattle. It was not beautiful in the way that places were beautiful in paintings. It was a working place, worn at the edges, practical in its every line. She recognized it for what it was, a place that had been held together through stubbornness and effort, and probably some luck, and that needed more of all 3. This is it, he said, pulling the horse to a stop in the yard. Evelyn looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her traveling bag and climbed down from the wagon. Show me the kitchen stove, she said. He climbed down after her. Yes, ma'am. They walked toward the house together through the cold morning, and the door opened ahead of them on its hinges from the wind, as though something was making space. Inside, the kitchen was large and cold and in considerable disorder. Dishes stacked imprecisely, a pot that needed scrubbing left on the back burner, flour scattered on the table from some earlier and abandoned effort. A young man was sitting at the far end of the table eating cornbread with the focused silence of someone fueling himself for physical labor. He looked up when they came in, and his eyes went to Evelyn with the uncomplicated surprise of someone who had not been told. Denny, Colt said, this is Evelyn Ashcroft. She's going to be staying with us for a while. Treat her with respect or answer to me. Denny Marsh, who looked to be about 30 and had the kind of face that moved fast through expressions, straightened slightly. Yes, sir, he said. Then to Evelyn, Morning, ma'am. Morning, she said. She walked to the stove, crouched down slightly to examine the firebox door and the damper, and said, Do you have wood split fine enough for starting, or just the big pieces? There's kindling in the box outside the back door, Colt said. Good. She stood up. Where are your matches? He pointed to the shelf above the window. She crossed to it, took the matchbox down, and turned to look at him. Go unload your lumber, she said. I'll have coffee ready in 20 minutes. Denny Marsh looked at Colt. Colt looked at Evelyn. Something in the line of his jaw shifted. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. 20 minutes, he said. 19 now, she said, and turned back to the stove. She heard him walk out the back door and heard Denny push his chair back and follow. And she was alone in the cold kitchen with the dead stove and the box of matches and the morning coming in through the window over the sink, thin and pale and honest. She opened the firebox door and looked inside. Old ash, not properly cleaned. The damper was partially blocked. The grate needed adjusting. She made a mental note of each problem in order. She had made it this far on her own terms, on nothing but the willingness to look at a situation clearly and decide what it actually required. She would make it further the same way. She took the kindling box in from the back step and started building the fire the right way, carefully, piece by piece, the small before the large, the flame before the fuel. By the time Colt Brennan came back in from the yard 18 minutes later, the kitchen was warming and the coffee pot was on. He looked at the stove and then at her and then at the coffee pot. "You said 20 minutes," he said. "I was being generous," she said. He took a cup from the shelf and held it out. She filled it. He took a sip and was quiet for a moment. "That's good coffee," he said. "I know," she said. Outside, the sun was fully up now, coming over the ridge to the east and spreading across the frost-white grass of the yard. From the barn, she could hear Toby, the young hand, talking to the horses in the particular soothing nonsense way that people who are good with animals do. The cattle were moving, the low sound of them carrying across the still morning air. There was a tremendous amount of work to do. She could see that plainly from where she stood. She finished her own coffee and set the cup down and went to find a broom. What happened next in Blackstone would take weeks to fully reveal itself, and when it did, it would be nothing like what the town expected. The people who had watched Evelyn Ashcroft stand on that platform alone and laughed about the old mail-order bride would eventually have to revise that story. But they would take their time about it, and they wouldn't be graceful when they did, and that was fine. Evelyn had never needed anyone's grace. She'd always preferred their respect, and respect, in her experience, was something you made people give you, not by demanding it, by becoming something they couldn't reasonably ignore. She had arrived with a suitcase and $14. She intended to build something worth considerably more than that. The broom she found behind the pantry door was missing half its bristles. Evelyn stood there looking at it for a moment, then swept the kitchen floor with it anyway, working around its inadequacy the way she'd learned to work around most inadequacies, methodically, covering the same ground twice where the broom failed to catch everything. Not complaining about it, but making a mental note that a new broom was needed and adding it to the list she was already building in her head. The list was getting long. By the end of that first full day on Brennan Ranch, she had identified 17 things that needed immediate attention, not counting the broom. The pantry shelves were poorly organized, dried goods mixed with hardware supplies, a tin of lamp oil sitting next to a sack of cornmeal in a way that was both dangerous and wasteful. 3 of the kitchen window latches were broken, which meant cold air came through the gaps at night in a steady thin stream that would cost more in firewood than the cost of fixing the latches. The water pump behind the house had a loose handle that required a specific downward pressure and a slight rightward angle to work properly, a fact she discovered by brute trial and error on her second trip out to it, her hands going numb in the morning cold before she figured out the trick of it. She did not tell Colt about any of this. She simply began fixing what she could fix and noted what she couldn't and moved forward. Denny Marsh watched her that first day with an expression she recognized. The particular wariness of a man who has been in a household long enough to feel ownership of its disorder and isn't sure whether the new person is a help or a judgment. He was polite in a stiff way, answering her direct questions with direct answers and not volunteering anything extra. Toby, the younger hand, was different. He was maybe 22, with a narrow face and ears that stuck out slightly and the kind of guileless openness that some young men had before life closed it down. He came into the kitchen for the midday meal and looked at the clean table and the swept floor and the organized shelves with undisguised relief. "It smells different in here," he said. "That's because I cleaned the grease off the stovetop," Evelyn said. "Sit down." He sat down. "Denny said you came off the train yesterday." "I did." Denny said... He stopped himself. "Go ahead," she said. He looked at his hands. "He said you were supposed to get married to somebody who wasn't here." "That's right." Toby considered this with the earnest gravity of a young man trying to process adult complexity. "That's real bad," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "It was." "Mr. Brennan brought you anyway. He offered. I chose to come." She set a plate of salt pork and biscuits in front of him. "There's a difference." He looked at the plate and then at her. "These biscuits are a lot better than what Denny makes." "I imagine most things are better than what Denny makes," she said, and Toby laughed, a quick surprise sound that he seemed to immediately feel was inappropriate, and he looked at the door as if checking whether Denny had heard. Denny hadn't. He was still out at the fence line where Colt had sent him after breakfast. Colt himself came in for the midday meal with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smear of something dark across his left forearm and the expression of a man who had been working hard since before sunrise and expected to continue doing so until after sunset. He sat down, looked at the food on the table, and ate without making a performance of gratitude or commentary, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated a compliment. Halfway through the meal, he said, "The south fence line has 3 sections down." "From the last storm?" she asked. He looked at her. "You know about the storm last month?" "Harold Briggs mentioned it at the depot when I was waiting. He said the eastern ranches took damage." Colt nodded slowly. 600 feet of fence. We've been patching, but we don't have enough wire. I need to get to the supply store in Blackstone before the cattle start drifting." "How long can you wait on it?" "A week, maybe 10 days if the weather holds." "What does the wire cost?" He named a figure. She did the arithmetic against what she knew of his operation from the scattered papers she'd found on the kitchen shelf that morning. Receipts, a ledger that was months behind, supply invoices that hadn't been matched against payments. She'd organized them into a rough order while the breakfast fire was building, not because he'd asked her to, but because disorder in a financial record offended something fundamental in her nature. "Have you collected payment from the Hendersons?" she asked. He stopped chewing and looked at her. "What do you know about the Hendersons?" "There's an invoice on your shelf dated 8 weeks ago for 30 head of cattle sold to a D. Henderson on the North Road. It doesn't have a corresponding payment record." A pause. Denny, who had come in midway through this, had stopped eating. "Henderson said he'd pay when his own buyers came through," Colt said. His voice had a careful quality to it. "Has that happened?" Another pause. Longer. "Not yet." "When was it supposed to?" He put his fork down, not in anger, more in the way of a man setting something aside so he could think clearly. 6 weeks ago." Evelyn said nothing. She let the number sit on the table between them. "I'll ride out to the Henderson place this week," Colt said. "Yes," she said. "I think you should." Denny was looking between them with an expression that had shifted from wariness to something more like respectful alarm. Toby was eating his biscuit with great concentration. Colt picked his fork back up. He finished his meal. He pushed his chair back and stood and looked at her for a moment. Not in challenge and not exactly in gratitude either, but in the particular way of a person who has received information they needed and isn't certain yet how to hold it. "Thank you for the meal," he said. "The stove needs a new gasket on the left burner," she said. "It's losing heat on that side. That's why your bread's been browning unevenly." He stared at her. "How do you know my bread's been browning unevenly?" "Because the pan on the shelf has burn marks on the right side and pale spots on the left," she said. "It's been that way for a while. You've been compensating by turning the pan, but that doesn't fix the underlying problem." Colt looked at Denny. Denny looked at the ceiling. Toby made a very small sound that might have been a laugh and immediately suppressed it. "Gasket," Colt said. "Hardware store in Blackstone will have it," she said. "Add it to your list when you go for the wire." He went back out to work. That night, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open in front of her and worked through it by lamplight until the numbers resolved themselves into a picture she could understand. It was not a good picture, but it was not a hopeless one either, and there was an important difference between those two things. The ranch had debt, a loan from the Blackstone Territorial Bank that had been structured with a balloon payment due the following spring. The interest was manageable, but the principal was substantial, and the cattle sales from the past year had been inconsistent. 3 transactions had been recorded incorrectly. 2 expenses appeared twice. The Henderson payment, if collected, would cover 3 months of operating costs. She wrote it out on a separate page in the neat, compact hand she'd developed over 11 years of keeping books. Clear figures, clear categories, nothing ornamented. When she was done, she set it next to the ledger and looked at it, and then she looked at the lamp flame for a moment and thought about what she was doing. She was in a stranger's house, organizing his financial life without being asked. A week ago, she'd been on a train crossing the country to marry someone who hadn't bothered to cancel the arrangement before disappearing. She was 56 years old, sleeping in a room with a bolt on the door in a ranch house she had no legal claim to, in a territory she'd never been to before, in the company of a man she'd known for 48 hours. This was, by most reasonable measures, a precarious situation. She closed the ledger, turned the lamp down, and went to bed. She slept soundly. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was punishing in its physical demands and oddly satisfying in its clarity. There was no ambiguity to ranch work. Each morning delivered a list of things that needed doing, and the list didn't care about her age or her history or what had happened at the Blackstone train depot. The fence needed wire. The cattle needed moving to the south pasture before the grass on the north wore down. The supply of salt blocks was getting low. 3 horses needed their shoes checked. She couldn't do all of it. She did what she could. She could cook, and she could organize, and she could keep the house running in a way that freed up Colt in the hands for the physical labor she wasn't built for. She could manage the pantry so that what food they had lasted further. She could look at a week's worth of supplies and tell you, within reason, how long they would last and what needed to be prioritized. What she hadn't expected was how quickly she'd develop a feel for the animals. It started with a mare named Clover that had been favoring her left foreleg for 2 weeks. Colt had looked at it, determined it wasn't a break, and moved on, which was what you did on a working ranch with limited time. Evelyn noticed the mare flinching when she crossed uneven ground, and spent 20 minutes one afternoon with the horse's leg in her hands, working through the feel of it the way her mother had taught her to examine a fabric for hidden tears. Slowly, systematically, without assumptions. She found the stone bruise on the frog of the hoof deep enough that it had been missed in the initial examination. She wasn't sure what to do about it beyond recognizing it. She went and found Colt in the barn. "The mare has a stone bruise," she said. "Deep one, left foreleg, toward the back of the frog." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "You sure? Come look." He came and looked and was quiet for a long moment. "You've got a good eye," he said finally. "I have good hands," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. "She needs soaking and rest. I don't have time to rest a horse right now." "Tell me what to do and I'll manage it," she said. He told her. She managed it. Over the following week, she soaked Clover's hoof morning and evening in warm water and Epsom salt, which she added to the supply list and which Colt brought back from Blackstone along with the fence wire and the stove gasket. The mare improved. Toby started calling her Miss Ev. She didn't correct him. She wasn't sure what the appropriate form of address was for a woman in her ambiguous position. Not a wife, not an employee, not a guest in any usual sense. And Miss Ev was accurate enough and kind in its way. Denny took longer. He wasn't cruel to her. He was simply careful in the way men were careful around situations they didn't understand. He did his work and ate his meals and said what needed saying and nothing more. And when she asked him a direct question, he answered it, but he kept a distance that was not unfriendly but was deliberate. About 3 weeks in, she found him in the yard trying to stitch a tear in a work glove with a needle too thick for the leather, making a mess of it. She sat down on the step beside him without asking and held out her hand for the glove. He looked at her hand. "I've almost got it," he said. "The thread's going to tear through," she said. "The needle's too heavy for that thickness. You need a saddle needle and lighter thread." A pause. He gave her the glove. She went inside, got her sewing kit from her room, came back out, and sat down on the step again. She worked on the glove for about 10 minutes in silence. He watched her hands. "Where'd you learn to sew?" he asked eventually. "My mother," she said. "Then professionally, 15 years. "Professionally," he repeated, as though filing it away. "I was a seamstress before I kept books," she said. "Before you—" "Right." A pause. "How come you answered one of those ads, if you don't mind me asking?" She tied off the thread and bit it clean. "Same reason anyone does," she said. "I wanted a different life than the one I had." She turned the glove right side out and examined the stitching. "The difference is most people want a better life. I wanted a different one. I wasn't sure it would be better. I just knew it would be different." Denny considered this. "And is it?" She looked at him. "Considerably," she said. He took the glove back and looked at the stitching and then at her. Something in his face shifted. Not warmth exactly, but the loosening of a deliberate distance. "That's decent work," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back to the barn. It wasn't a friendship, but it was a border crossing of some kind, and she noted it. What she didn't note, or didn't acknowledge noting, was the way Colt Brennan watched her when he thought she wasn't watching back. It wasn't obvious. He was a man who had learned to keep most things inside. She could see that clearly enough. But there were moments when she was working at the stove with her back to the room, or when she was at the table with the ledger, or once when she was in the yard talking to Tobe about the water trough while doing something practical with her hands, when she would turn and find him looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not desire, not sentiment, something quieter and more serious than either of those things. She didn't address it. The situation was complicated enough. What complicated it further was the town. She'd been at the ranch nearly a month when she went back to Blackstone for the first time. Colt needed to pick up a livestock order, and she needed to get supplies that had run low, and it was practical to go together. She didn't think much about it until they pulled into town and she registered the quality of attention their arrival generated. It wasn't subtle. People looked. People leaned toward each other. On the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, two women who had clearly been in conversation stopped as Colt's wagon passed and followed it with their eyes with the particular focused interest of people who are updating information they already considered interesting. Inside the dry goods store, the man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow named Purvis, who had a loud manner and the confidence of someone who is the primary source of local information, said to Colt, directly in front of Evelyn, "So you kept the old bride, did you?" Colt's jaw tightened. Before he could speak, Evelyn said, "I need 20 pounds of flour, 10 of cornmeal, and whatever you have in the way of dried navy beans." She looked at Purvis with the calm directness of a woman who has been keeping other people's accounts for 11 years and knows exactly what things are worth. "And I'd appreciate not being discussed as though I'm an item of livestock you're deciding whether to bid on." Purvis blinked. "The flour first," she said. "If you have a fresh supply, the bag you sold to the Brennan account 3 months ago had weevils in the bottom third." That's not," he stopped. "I don't know anything about weevils." "I noticed them in the canister when I reorganized the pantry," she said. "I'd recommend checking your current stock before you sell it to anyone else. That's a liability issue if someone gets sick." The store was not large and there were other people in it. Every one of them was listening. Purvis got her the flour. He was considerably more careful about his manner for the rest of the transaction. Outside, Colt loaded the supplies into the wagon in silence. When he was done, he stood with his hands on the wagon board and looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "He called me old," she said. "He can call me a lot of things that are accurate. That one I'll own. But he called me the old bride like it was a joke, and there's a difference." Colt looked at the wagon. "Purvis talks to everyone like that." "I know," she said. "That's why someone should stop letting him." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The weevil thing. That was real?" "Completely," she said. "You could have told me." I threw them out and replaced the canister. It didn't seem worth a conversation at the time. She picked up her traveling bag. "Ready?" He wasn't quite ready. He was still looking at her with that expression she couldn't name, the one that had gotten no less frequent over the past month, and which she was getting increasingly efficient at pretending not to notice. "Evelyn," he said. "Colt. You don't have to stay if it's not what you wanted." She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you imagine I wanted?" she asked. He opened his mouth and closed it. "I don't know," he said. "Something better than this, maybe." "I wanted something real," she said. "I've got real. Real is fine." She climbed up to the wagon bench. "Come on, we've still got the livestock order to collect." He climbed up and they drove to the livestock yard at the edge of town. What she didn't say, and what she turned over that night in the privacy of her room with its bolted door, was that the word real had started to mean more than she'd intended when she said it. The ranch was real. The work was real. The cold mornings and the difficult stove and the mare with the stone bruise and the ledger that she'd gotten nearly current, all of it was real in the way that things are real when they require something from you and give something back. But there were other things she was less sure about, like the fact that when Colt came into the kitchen at the end of a long day with his sleeves rolled up and stood at the sink washing the day off his hands and said, simply and without preamble, "What smells good?" She felt something that was not nothing. She was 56 years old. She knew the difference between nothing and something. She also knew that she was in a precarious position in this man's house, that she had no formal claim to anything here, and that feeling something was not the same as knowing what to do with it. So she noted it the way she noted the loose pump handle and the broken window latches, as a fact requiring attention, not yet resolved. The gossip, meanwhile, had escalated beyond what she'd encountered in Purvis's dry goods store. She became aware of this through the particular communication network of rural areas, which moves faster and with greater specificity than most people credit. Toby told her, with his guileless earnestness, that folks in town were saying the old mail-order bride had taken over the Brennan operation and was bossing everyone around, and that Colt had gone soft. "What do you think?" she asked him. He considered it with his usual seriousness. "I think the food's better and the horses are healthier and Denny doesn't look as miserable," he said. "And I think Mr. Brennan's less behind on things than he was." He paused. "I don't know what bossing someone around means if the things they're being bossed into are things that needed doing." "That," she told him, "is a wise observation. My ma said something like it once," he said. From a neighboring ranch, the Callaway operation 4 miles east, there came a more specific kind of interference. A man named Gerald Callaway sent his foreman over with an informal message that was really a question dressed up as courtesy. Was Brennan taking on a housekeeper, or was there some other arrangement? And if there was some other arrangement, perhaps certain people in the area would be interested to know the nature of it. Colt told the foreman to tell Gerald Callaway to mind his own affairs. The foreman relayed this and came back the following week with a second message. Callaway would be interested in purchasing the North Pasture acreage if Brennan was finding the operation difficult to maintain. A fair price would be offered. Colt told the foreman that the North Pasture wasn't for sale. The foreman came back a third time, and this time Evelyn answered the door because Colt was out at the south fence, and she saw no reason to ride out to find him for a conversation she could handle herself. The foreman, a rangy man named Perch, with a sharp, watchful face, was visibly surprised to find her at the door. He explained his errand. Evelyn listened to it fully. Then she said, "Tell Mr. Callaway that Mr. Brennan's financial position is considerably stronger than it was 2 months ago, that the Henderson payment has been collected," which it had after Colt's ride out there 3 weeks prior, and that if he's genuinely interested in purchasing land, there are vacant parcels to the north being sold by the Territorial Bank that might suit his purposes. But the Brennan North Pasture is not one of them and won't be. Perch looked at her with narrow eyes. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. "I keep the books here," she said pleasantly. "Good afternoon." She closed the door. That evening, she told Colt about it over supper. He was quiet through most of her account, eating with his fork in one hand and his elbow on the table. A habit she'd noticed and not corrected because a man's table manners in his own kitchen were his own business. And when she was done, he was quiet for another moment. "You told him about the Henderson money?" he said. "I told him it had been collected. I didn't give him figures." "Why?" "Because Callaway is buying up land on the Eastern Ridge," she said. "I've seen the deed transfers in the county record that Harold Briggs had posted at the depot last month. He's been acquiring parcels. If he thinks you're financially vulnerable, he'll push harder. If he thinks you're stable, he'll look elsewhere." Colt set his fork down. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight with an expression that was no longer the unnameable one she'd been cataloging, but something more direct, more open, as though a decision had been made behind it. "Evelyn," he said, "Colt, you've been doing a lot of things around here that I didn't ask you to do." She met his gaze. "Yes," she said, "I have." A pause. The lamp between them flickered once as a draft moved through the kitchen. "I'm not complaining," he said. "I didn't think you were." Another pause. He picked his fork back up. "The North Pasture is good land," he said. "Best grass on the property. I'm not selling it to Callaway for any price." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't let him think there was room to negotiate." Colt ate the rest of his supper. When he was done, he carried his plate to the sink and washed it himself, which he'd started doing about a week in without her asking, and which she'd noticed and not commented on. At the door to the kitchen, he paused. "What you said to Purvis in the store," he said, "about being called old." She looked at him. "What about it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the door frame rather than at her. "I was going to say something to him. You were faster." "I usually am," she said. He made a sound that was as close to a genuine laugh as she'd heard from him. It was short and a little rough, and it suited him. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. "Good night, Colt." He went out. She listened to his boots on the floorboards going down the hall, and then the quiet of the house settling around her, and the sound of the wind picking up outside, the first real cold of late autumn starting to push down from the mountains to the north. She sat at the table for a while with the lamp and the ledger and the sound of the wind, and she thought about the fact that she was, against every reasonable expectation, not unhappy. It was not the life she'd imagined crossing the country for. It was harder and lonelier in some ways and less certain than anything she'd been promised. But there was something in the difficulty of it that felt strangely and precisely like what she'd actually been looking for. Not comfort, something sturdier than that. Outside the kitchen window, the first few flakes of early snow began to fall, pale against the dark, dropping silently past the glass and disappearing into the dark ground below. She turned back to the ledger and kept working. The snow that had begun as a few pale flakes outside the kitchen window became, over the following 2 weeks, a serious problem. It wasn't a blizzard yet, that came later, but the early winter that settled over the territory in the last days of November was harder than anyone had predicted, and the ranch felt it immediately. The water trough in the south yard froze overnight 3 times in the first week, which meant Toby was out before sunrise each morning with an axe breaking the ice so the cattle could drink. The hay supply in the east barn, which Evelyn had flagged in the ledger as running lower than it should be for the season, started to look genuinely worrying by the second week of cold. Colt made 2 trips to the feed store in Blackstone in 4 days and came back both times with the wagon loaded full and his jaw set in the particular way it set when the money side of things was pressing on him. She didn't ask him about it directly. She looked at the ledger instead, which was honest about things that men sometimes weren't, and she ran the numbers 3 times to make sure she had them right. The morning after his second Blackstone run, she put a piece of paper on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup before he was fully awake. He sat down, looked at it, looked at her. "What is this?" he said. "It's your feed costs for the next 6 weeks if we keep buying at the current rate," she said, "versus what it would cost if you sold the 12 youngest steers now, before the weight drops off them in the cold, and use that money to buy feed in bulk from the Hargrove operation up north. They sell wholesale if you buy in quantity." He stared at the paper. His coffee sat untouched beside it. "You talked to Hargrove, Schatz?" he said. "I sent a letter with Toby when he went to collect the mail last Tuesday," she said. Hargrove wrote back, the letters behind the paper. He picked up the paper and found the letter under it. He read it. He set both down and picked up his coffee and drank half of it in one long pull and looked out the window at the frozen yard. "The 12 youngest," he said. "They're your lowest weight animals. They'll lose more ground in the cold than the older ones, and the feed cost per pound of gain will be higher. Selling now makes more sense than carrying them through winter at a loss." "I know that," he said. His voice wasn't sharp, but it had an edge to it. The edge of a man who does know something and doesn't particularly enjoy having it confirmed in writing. "I just hadn't done it yet." "I know you hadn't," she said. "That's why I wrote it down." He looked at her. She looked back at him. It was the kind of moment that could have gone several directions. She'd had enough of them in her life to recognize the fork in it. And she kept her face neutral and waited to see which way he'd take it. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He took the paper and the letter and folded them and put them in his shirt pocket. "I'll talk to Hargrove this week," he said. "All right," she said. He went out into the cold. She watched through the window as he crossed the yard to the barn, his breath making quick white clouds, his boots leaving clean tracks in the frost. Then she poured herself a second cup of coffee and sat down and looked at the ledger and tried not to feel the specific satisfaction of a problem being addressed in the way it needed to be addressed. She wasn't always successful at suppressing that feeling. It was one of her less admirable qualities, the quiet pleasure she took in order emerging from disorder. Her daughter had pointed it out once. "You like being right, Mama." She hadn't argued the point. What she hadn't expected, riding north to Hargrove's operation with Colt 3 days later to complete the bulk deal, was the detour. He pulled the wagon off the road about 2 miles north of the ranch, down a track she hadn't noticed before, and stopped at the top of a low ridge. Below them, the land opened wide, a long, shallow valley, grass brown and frost white, with a creek cutting through it and a stand of cottonwoods bare and gray in the winter light. The mountains were visible to the northwest, closer looking in the cold, clear air than they would be in summer. She looked at it for a moment. He didn't say anything. "This is your land?" she asked. "Part of it," he said. "The south section of the north pasture. What Calloway wants." She looked at it again. She understood why Calloway wanted it. The creek would make it good grazing country in spring and summer, and the valley's orientation would shelter cattle from the north wind in winter. It was worth considerably more than any fair price Calloway had mentioned. "He's been after it for 3 years, Colt said. "Before you got here. I kept saying no." "But," a pause. He was looking at the valley. "But when the money gets tight, it's harder to keep saying no. He knows that." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "That's why he sends Perch every few weeks. He's not negotiating, he's waiting." "He won't be waiting much longer if the feed situation stays manageable," she said. "The Hargrove deal changes the math." "I know it does. That's why I arranged it." He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was the unnameable one again, but closer to having a name now. Gratitude was part of it. Something more complicated was the rest. "Why?" he asked, not harshly, genuinely. She considered how to answer that, and she answered it honestly because she'd made a policy of honesty in the last decade and didn't intend to stop. "Because it's the right thing to do for the operation," she said, "and because you showed me a decent thing on a train platform when you didn't have to, and because—" She paused, watching the valley below them. "Because I don't want Calloway to get this land. It's worth keeping." He was quiet for a while. "Yes," he said finally, "it is." They drove on to Hargrove's and made the deal and loaded the first portion of feed and came back in the early dark of winter afternoon and unloaded it, and she went inside to start supper, and he went to see to the horses, and that was all, and nothing was said about the ridge or what had been said at it. But something had shifted slightly in the arrangement between them, and she was aware of it the way you were aware of a change in barometric pressure, not seeing it directly, but feeling its weight in the air. The blizzard came on a Tuesday. She knew it was coming before it arrived. There was a quality to the light the previous afternoon, a flattened yellowish tone at the horizon, and the cattle in the south pasture were moving restlessly, pushing against the fence in the way they did when weather was building. She mentioned it to Colt at supper that Monday evening. "I know," he said. "The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 3 hours this afternoon. We'll get it by tomorrow morning. Are the cattle in? South herd's in the lower barn. North herd's still in the north pasture. There's a windbreak up there that should hold them, and I can't get them all in before dark." "The windbreak is sufficient?" "It's been sufficient before." He looked at his plate and then at her. "It should be sufficient." She recognized the difference between should be and will be, but didn't push it. He knew his land and his animals better than she did, and there was a point at which observation became interference. She went to bed at her usual hour and woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of the wind. It was not the regular wind that came down off the mountains at night. It was something else entirely. A wall of it, a sustained roar with gusts inside it that made the timber frame of the house shudder and flex. She lay in the dark for a moment listening to it, then got up and went to the window. She couldn't see much. The lantern light from the barn was a blurred yellow smear. Snow was moving horizontally, driven by the wind, piling against the west wall of the house. The temperature had dropped far enough that the inside of her window had a film of frost on it. She got dressed. Not completely. She stopped at her second layer and then thought about it and put on the third one too, and her heaviest coat and the wool scarf she'd packed at the bottom of her suitcase on the theory that she'd probably need it out here and probably hadn't packed it warm enough. She went into the kitchen and built up the fire and put water on and was standing at the stove when she heard the back door open. Toby came in with snow caked on his coat and his ears red from cold and his eyes too wide. "Miss Ev," he said. "There's trouble." She'd already started moving toward her coat. "The north herd?" "The windbreak came down," he said. "A whole section of it. The cattle are moving, and Mr. Brennan went out to try to turn them, and the team spooked, and the wagon went over, and he stopped. He was breathing hard from running across the yard in the blizzard. He's trapped. Wagon axle landed across his legs. Denny's with him, but we can't lift it. She registered the information without panic. Panic was a luxury she'd never been able to afford, and she'd managed to make a virtue of that incapacity. Is he conscious? She said. Yes, ma'am. He's in pain. A lot of it. Is it his legs or his hips? Toby blinked. I don't know. His legs, I think. Is he breathing normally? I think so. He was talking when I left. All right. She was already fully dressed. She picked up the lamp from the hook by the door. Show me. Toby looked at her. The storm. I know about the storm, she said. Show me. They went out into it. She had been in bad winter weather before. Ohio got hard winters, and she'd walked through ice storms and driven through snowfall that reduced visibility to nothing. But this was different in its intensity, in the physical force of the wind that pushed against her chest like something with intention. She kept her head down and followed Toby's boots through the accumulating snow, and when a gust hit broadside, it was genuinely difficult to maintain direction. The wagon was about 200 feet north of the barn, at the edge of the north pasture where the windbreak section had given way. She could hear the cattle before she could see them, a churning, anxious sound, the specific noise of a large herd that has been frightened and has no place to go. Denny was crouched beside the wagon. He looked up when she came through the driving snow, and his expression did something complicated, relief and uncertainty fighting each other. Colt was on the ground, the front axle across his lower legs. The wagon had gone over on its left side. He was on his back looking up at nothing, his jaw clenched hard and his breathing coming in sharp, controlled pulls through his nose that told her he was managing serious pain by sheer concentration. She crouched beside him. Colt. He looked at her. His eyes were clear, which was the important thing. Evelyn. His voice came out compressed and tight. I told Toby not to bring you out here. I know you did, she said. She put her hand on his chest, feeling his breathing, not for comfort, even and full, if difficult. Can you feel your feet? Yes, they hurt like hell. That's a good sign. Can you move your toes? A pause, a grimace. Left, yes. Right, I think so. He exhaled through clenched teeth. The right one's worse. She looked at the axle across his legs. It was resting on him just below the knee on the left and higher on the right, maybe mid-shin. The wagon body was still mostly intact, which meant the full weight wasn't on him. The angle of the ground was taking some of it. Not enough. What can we use to lever it? She said to Denny. I've been looking, he said. There's no... I had a fence post from the load and it snapped. The windbreak sections that came down, she said. What are they made of? Timber posts and rail, he said. But they're under the snow now, 20 feet north. Get them, she said. Toby, go with him. She looked back at Colt. I need you to hold still and stay awake. I'm not going anywhere, he said dryly through the pain. I know. I need you talking so I know you're conscious. He looked at her. Something in his eyes, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition. You're very calm, he said. I'm furious, she said. There's no point in showing it right now. A short exhale that might have been a laugh. Who are you furious at? The windbreak, mostly. Talk to me. How long has that section been weak? It wasn't weak, he said, his voice straining. The post anchors were... He stopped and breathed through something. The anchors were deep. The wind was too strong. All right. She looked at the cattle moving beyond them in the dark and the snow. How many in the north herd? 83 head? Are they going toward the south fence or north? South, I think. Denny had started turning them before. Another controlled breath. Before the wagon went. So they'll run into the south fence and stop. If the south fence holds... We repaired that section 2 weeks ago, she said. I ordered the wire. I remember. Denny and Toby came back with 2 sections of windbreak rail, heavy timber 8 feet long. She directed them to position the rails under the axle at angles, creating leverage points on either side of Colt's legs, and she stood between them, and put her weight on the rail closest to her and told them both to lift on 3. They lifted. The axle rose 3 inches. Not enough. She pushed down on the rail with everything she had. 56 years old, not a particularly large woman, her boots slipping in the snow, and felt the rail bite into the frozen ground and the axle rise another 2 inches. "Move," she said to Colt. "Now, toward me. Left first." He moved. He didn't make a sound doing it, which told her how much it cost him. He dragged himself by his arms through the snow while she held the rail, and Denny and Toby held theirs, and when he was clear, she said, "Drop it," and they dropped it, and she went to her knees beside him in the snow. "Both legs," he said. Not a question. "Can you stand?" He tried. He could get his left leg under him. The right wouldn't hold. His face went white and then gray, and then he set his jaw and stopped trying. "No," he said. "That's all right," she said. "Toby, get the board from the wagon bed. The widest one you can pull free. We'll use it as a sled." She looked at Colt. "We're going to drag you to the barn. It's going to be unpleasant." "More unpleasant than this?" he said. "Approximately the same," she said. "Ready?" It took them 20 minutes to get him to the barn, which was 20 minutes of brutal physical work in blizzard conditions that she was not going to think too carefully about afterward. She directed it and pushed and pulled and didn't stop. And when they finally had him inside and the barn doors shut against the wind, she stood with her hands on her knees for a moment and allowed herself 30 seconds of not directing anything. Then she stood up. "Toby," she said, "I need the town doctor. Can you ride in this weather?" Toby had been at the ranch since spring. He was young and capable, and his face was flushed from cold and exertion and something that looked like the particular alertness of a person who has just discovered what they're made of. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "How long to Blackstone in these conditions?" "Hour and a half, maybe 2. "Take the gray," she said. "She's the steadiest in bad weather. Stay on the road. Don't cut across the pasture. I don't care how much time it saves. Not in this visibility. Find Dr. Marsh. Tell him a man's down with possible fractures below the knee, right leg, primary concern. He's conscious and not losing blood but needs to be seen as soon as possible." She paused. "Tell him I said it, and he'll know I'm not exaggerating." Toby blinked. "Does he know you?" "He will after you tell him the woman from the Brennan Ranch sent you," she said. "Go!" Toby went. She turned to Denny. "We need to get him somewhere I can examine those legs properly. Inside the barn is better than outside, but not by much in this cold. Can we make it to the house?" Denny looked at Colt, who was propped against a hay bale, with his eyes half closed and his breathing controlled and deliberate. "He can't walk." "I know that. We need something to carry him on." They found a section of flat fencing that worked as a litter. Not comfortable, but functional. Getting Colt from the barn to the house was another piece of work she filed under necessary, and didn't examine too closely in terms of effort. He was heavier than he looked, and the distance between the barn and the house back door felt considerably longer in a blizzard at 4 a.m. Inside, she got him onto the kitchen floor because the table was the right height for examination, and the bedroom was too far. She cut his right trouser leg from the hem to above the knee with the scissors from her sewing kit and looked at what was there without flinching. The right leg was bad. She'd suspected it would be. There was swelling already, serious and rapid, and the shape of it below mid-shin had the specific wrongness that meant bone. The left was bruised, badly bruised, but when she ran her hands along the bone, she didn't feel the same wrongness, and his response when she pressed along it was pain, but not the sharp localized pain that usually meant fracture. "Right leg's broken," she told him directly. "Left's bruised. Possibly a crack in the left, but I don't think so." He had his head back against the floor and was looking at the ceiling. "You sure?" "No," she said. "That's why I sent for the doctor." "How long?" Toby said 2 hours in these conditions. He was quiet. She packed clean cloth around the right leg. She didn't splint it because she didn't know enough and improper splinting could do more damage than leaving it, and elevated it on a rolled blanket and covered him with the 2 heaviest blankets she had and put her hand on his forehead to check for signs of shock. He was cold from being outside, but his skin wasn't clammy and his eyes were clear, and his pulse, when she pressed her fingers to his wrist, was steady if elevated. "You're not in shock," she told him. Good, he said. You're going to want to be. It's going to hurt more in about 20 minutes when the cold wears off completely. I know, he said. I've broken things before. She poured whiskey from the bottle on the kitchen shelf and brought it to him. He looked at it. Is that medicinal or just practical? It's practical, she said. I'm not going to tell you it'll help your leg, it won't. But the next hour is going to be difficult, and it might help you manage it. He took the glass. He drank about half of it and then held the glass on his chest and looked at the ceiling some more. Denny had gone back out. The cattle still needed managing, blizzard or not, and she'd told him to do what he could and not take risks and come back in if the visibility got worse. She was alone with Colt in the kitchen, and the wind was hitting the north wall of the house in sustained, steady assaults, and the lamp was burning low, and she went and filled it from the oil can under the sink and came back and sat on the floor beside him because it was the closest she could get without being on him. Tell me how the north herd got out, she said. Not because she didn't understand it, but because keeping him talking was the priority right now. The windbreak section went, he said. Third post from the east end. I saw it go from the barn door and went out to try to get ahead of the cattle before they moved. Alone. Denny and Toby were with the south herd. You should have waited. If I'd waited, they'd have been through the gap and into the east pasture and then on to Calloway's land, and I'd have spent a week retrieving them. He paused. I made a judgment call. A poor one, she said. Yes, he agreed without defensiveness. It was. She looked at his leg and then at him. Colt. Evelyn. When the doctor comes, be honest about the pain level. Don't minimize it. Men who minimize it when talking to doctors make bad decisions worse. Yes, ma'am, he said, with something in his tone that was on the far side of tired. I'm serious. I know you are, he said. You're always serious. A pause. It's not a criticism. She didn't respond to that. She adjusted the blanket over his right leg, which was trembling now with the pain that was coming in as the cold released it, and she watched his face carefully and thought about what Dr. Marsh was going to need when he arrived, and she made a mental list of it and went about quietly assembling it. Boiled water, clean cloth. The lamp moved to the right position, the table cleared, while Colt lay on the kitchen floor and breathed through the pain with the grim concentration of a man who had learned a long time ago that most things had to be endured before they got better. Denny came back in at some point, she'd lost track of time, and reported the south herd was contained and the north herd had in fact run into the south fence which had held, and he'd counted what he could see in the dark and weather, and it looked like none were missing. She noted this as a good thing, and sent him to dry off and get warm and told him to be ready to help when the doctor arrived. At 6:20 in the morning, with the blizzard still hammering the west side of the house, she heard horses in the yard. She went to the door and opened it, and Toby was there with a small man in a heavy coat who moved with the economic precision of someone who had been making house calls in bad weather for a long time and had stopped being affected by the conditions. Dr. Marsh, she said. You're the woman who sent for me, he said, stepping inside and pulling off his outer coat in one practiced motion. Evelyn Ashcroft, she said. Show me the patient, he said. She showed him. He examined Colt for about 15 minutes without speaking except for necessary questions directed at Colt and one technical question directed at her about the position the axle had been resting in when she'd found him. He answered his own questions methodically and without theater, and she respected him for it. Right tibia, he said finally. Clean break, I think. No displacement. Left leg? I want to see again in better light, but I believe you're right about the bruising. He looked up at her. Good field work. Not splinting it was the right call. I didn't know what I was doing well enough to try, she said. Same result, he said. Now I need hot water and clean linen and you to hold the lamp while I work. I have all of those, she said. She held the lamp while Dr. Marsh worked, and when Colt made sounds, she didn't look at his face because she knew he would prefer she didn't. Outside, the blizzard began, slowly and without announcement, to ease. By 8 in the morning, there was pale light coming through the kitchen window, and the wind had dropped from its sustained roar to something intermittent and manageable. Dr. Marsh had Colt's right leg properly splinted and wrapped, had given him something for the pain that had finally allowed the set jaw to relax, and was washing his hands at the kitchen sink. 6 weeks minimum, he told Colt. 8 before you put real weight on it. I'll come back in a week to check the wrap. I've got cattle to manage, Colt said. His voice was blunted now, the sharp edges of pain worn down by the medicine. Your cattle will be managed, Dr. Marsh said, with the tone of a man who has told injured ranchers this before and has learned not to argue the point too directly. Colt looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him. Your cattle will be managed, she said. Dr. Marsh left before 9, with Toby riding escort back to the Blackstone Road. Denny went back out to check the herd in the lifting weather. The house settled into a quiet that felt earned. The specific quiet after a crisis that has been contained but not yet fully resolved. Colt was on the kitchen floor still, the medicine pulling him toward sleep. She'd put 3 more blankets on him and a pillow under his head, and the stove was burning properly and the kitchen was warm. She sat in the chair by the table with a cup of cold coffee and looked at him. He was looking at her. His eyes were heavy but open. You rode out in that, he said. His voice was loose and slow now. In the blizzard. You didn't have to. I know, she said. You could have stayed inside. So could you, she said. But you went out for your cattle. He was quiet for a moment. That's different, he said. Is it? He didn't answer. His eyes were closing. Evelyn, he said, almost asleep. Colt. The Henderson payment. His voice was barely above a murmur now. The Hargrove deal. The stove gasket. A pause. The broom with the missing bristles. What about them? I noticed, he said. All of it. I noticed all of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Get some sleep, she said. He slept. Outside the window, the storm was passing east, the sky beginning to break apart into pale winter blue above the gray, and the frost-white landscape emerged from the blizzard's diminishing curtain like something returned after a long absence, battered and rearranged and still standing. He slept through most of that first day, which Dr. Marsh had said he would, and which Evelyn took as a reasonable indication that the medicine was doing what it was supposed to do. She checked on him every hour, not hovering, just passing through the kitchen on her way to something else, and noting the quality of his breathing and the color in his face and whether the blankets had shifted off the right leg. By mid-afternoon, he was sleeping with more ease than he'd shown in the first hours, and she turned her attention to the dozen other things the blizzard had left behind. The north pasture fence was the largest immediate problem. Denny had done a preliminary assessment in the clearing weather and come back with a count. 9 sections compromised, 3 of them fully down. The windbreak that had failed on Colt's watch was the worst, but the storm had found weak points elsewhere along the north and east lines and pressed on them until they gave. She went out herself to look at it in the early afternoon with Denny beside her, walking the fence line in the packed snow. And she took notes on a piece of folded paper with the stub of a pencil she kept in her coat pocket. Can you fix sections yourself? She asked Denny. You and Toby? Without Colt directing it? He was quiet for a moment, which was Denny's way of being honest. Most of it, he said. The north corner is tricky, the ground's frozen solid, and we'll need to drive new posts. That's harder in winter. What do you need for it? He told her. She added it to her list. When they got back to the house, she sent Toby to Blackstone the next morning with a written supply order and enough money from the ranch account. She'd gotten Colt to tell her where the cash box was before the medicine put him fully under, and specific instructions about what to accept as substitution if the hardware store was out of certain gauges of wire. Colt woke properly on the morning of the second day, which was to say he was coherent and irritable and trying to get himself upright before she'd gotten to the kitchen to start the fire. She found him with his hands flat on the floor behind him, attempting to push himself to sitting, and his right leg trembling with the effort of not moving. Stop, she said. I need to get up, he said. You need to stay flat, she said. Dr. Marsh said, I know what Dr. Marsh said. His voice was rough with sleep and pain and the particular frustration of a physical man in a physically helpless situation. I've got 9 sections of fence down, and a herd that's been running loose in a blizzard, and 8 sections now, she said. Denny fixed the east line yesterday afternoon. The lumber you picked up last month was the right size for it. He stopped pushing himself up. He looked at her. Toby's in Blackstone getting wire and post supplies, she continued, moving to the stove and crouching to open the firebox. Denny has a plan for the north corner, but says the frozen ground will slow them. I've asked him to prioritize the sections closest to the creek first because that's where the cattle will push if they decide to drift. The herd count yesterday evening was 81. 2 are unaccounted for, but Denny thinks they may have moved to the east shelter before the worst of the storm and just haven't come back yet. A silence from behind her. "Sit up if you need to," she said, "but use the chair. Don't put weight on the right leg." She heard him moving carefully, heard the scrape of the chair she'd left within reach, heard the controlled exhale of a man managing serious pain without wanting to admit to it. 81, he said. Yes. The 2 missing. Denny will look this morning. The weather's clear. She got the fire going and stood up. Coffee first, or do you need the medicine? Coffee, he said. The medicine makes me useless. You're going to be useless for 6 weeks regardless, she said. The question is whether you're in pain while you're useless. That's a cheerful way to put it. I'm not a cheerful person in the mornings, she said. You know that by now. He was sitting in the chair with his right leg stretched out in front of him and his arms on the table, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had aged slightly overnight. Not in a bad way, but in the way that physical suffering compressed things, brought the underlying structure of a face closer to the surface. He looked more himself, somehow, than he did on regular days. She poured his coffee and brought it to him, and he took it with both hands the way he always did and drank it without comment, which was also the way he always did. The letter, he said, after about half a cup. She looked at him. What letter? There was mail in the supply run Toby made before the blizzard. I put it in my coat pocket and then the storm. He nodded toward the peg by the back door where his coat hung, still stiff with dried ice at the collar. I haven't looked at it. She went and got the coat and reached into the inner pocket and found 3 pieces of mail, slightly damp at the edges from the blizzard. 2 were business. The feed invoice from Hargrove and a circular from the Blackstone Territorial Bank that she set aside for the ledger. The third was an envelope that she didn't recognize, addressed to Evelyn Ashcroft in care of the Brennan Ranch, Blackstone Territory. She stood with it for a moment. The handwriting was a man's. She knew it from the correspondence, though she hadn't seen it in months. It was the same deliberate, slightly backward slanting script that Raymond Hollis had used in the 7 letters he'd sent her from this territory before she'd packed her single suitcase and bought the train ticket. She brought it to the table and set it in front of Colt without opening it. He looked at it. He looked at her. You know who it's from? Yes, she said. You're not going to open it? Not right now, she said. She sat down across from him and picked up her own coffee. There's too much else to do this morning. He looked at the envelope for a moment longer and then looked at her. She could see him deciding whether to say something and deciding against it, which was the right call, and she appreciated that he made it. She opened the envelope 2 days later, sitting alone at the kitchen table after supper while Colt was doing the slow, effortful work of moving himself around the house that Dr. Marsh had said was acceptable, not weight-bearing, just circulation and movement, and Denny and Toby had gone to the bunkhouse. Raymond Hollis had a lot to say for himself. The letter was 3 pages, which surprised her. She'd expected less. A few lines, a perfunctory apology, maybe an explanation that was really just an excuse given better grammar. Instead, she got 3 pages of careful, considered writing that told her he'd ended up in New Mexico territory with money from the ranch sale, that he'd made more money there in a mining venture, that he had a house now, and what he described as a comfortable life. He said he'd behaved badly. He said it more than once, in varying phrasings, none of which were quite the same as taking responsibility, but which together amounted to something in the neighborhood of it. He said he'd heard, through the kind of informal information network that connected frontier communities across hundreds of miles, that she'd ended up at the Brennan Ranch and appeared to be doing well, and that hearing this had given him the push to write what he'd been drafting in his head for months. He said he had property now. He said he had money. He said he was aware that an offer made under these circumstances looked like what it was, too late and too convenient, but that he was making it anyway because he believed she deserved to know it was available. He offered her a home. He offered her comfort. He offered her what he called a proper life, which she read 3 times before she understood that what he meant by it was a life other people would look at and recognize as legitimate. He signed it Raymond, without the formality of his last name, which she thought was a calculated choice. She folded the letter back into its envelope and sat with it for a while. Colt came back into the kitchen on his crutches. Denny had fashioned them out of timber, rough but functional. And he looked at her face and at the envelope on the table, and he pulled out the opposite chair and sat down heavily. "Bad news?" he said. "No," she said. "An offer." She slid the envelope across the table. He looked at it without touching it. "Do you want me to read it?" "I'll tell you what it says," she said. And she did, concisely. The way she'd have summarized a business document, the facts in order, without inflection. When she was finished, he was quiet for a while. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She looked at the table, then at him. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. She didn't know yet. She was aware that not knowing was its own kind of answer, but she hadn't finished thinking it through, and she wasn't going to pretend she had. He nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee cup, which was empty. "He's got money," he said. It wasn't a question. "Apparently." "And a house." "Yes." "And he's asking you to come." "He is." Colt turned the empty cup in his hands, a slow rotation, looking at it. "I can't offer you those things," he said. His voice was even, no performance to it. "I can't offer you money or a house that's your own or a comfortable life. What I've got is a cattle operation that's been 2 months away from serious trouble twice in the last year, and a leg that's going to keep me off it for 6 weeks, and 2 ranch hands, and a lot of work that doesn't stop because the weather's bad." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you to go," he said, still looking at the cup. "I'm telling you what's accurate." "I know what's accurate," she said. "I keep your books." He looked up at that. Something moved through his expression quickly. Something that might have been the closest thing to a smile he was capable of in this kind of conversation. "Colt," she said. "Evelyn?" "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. "The real reason, not the practical one." He set the cup down. He looked at her steadily. "You were standing on that platform," he said. "Everybody was looking at you. Harold Briggs looked at you like you were a problem to be managed. Those cowboys were looking at you like a joke, and you were standing there with your head up and your hands folded, and you wouldn't give any of them the satisfaction of seeing it land." He paused. "I've been on that platform," he said. "Not that platform, but that situation, where everything you counted on disappears and the whole town's watching to see what you do." She said nothing. "I brought you here because you deserved better than what you were getting," he said. "And because—" He stopped. He looked at the window. "Because the ranch needed help. That's also true." "Both things can be true," she said. "They can," he said. "They are." She picked up Raymond Hollis's letter and held it for a moment, and then she set it down. "I'm going to Blackstone tomorrow," she said, "to send a reply." Colt looked at her. "All right," he said, careful. "I'm going to tell him no," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. "Evelyn, I've thought about it," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 days. That's enough time. I know my own mind." She looked at him directly. "What he's offering isn't what I want. What he calls a proper life is a life that looks right to other people. I've had that. It's not enough." Colt was looking at her with the expression that had finally gotten a name in her head over the past weeks. She'd stopped calling it unnameable about 3 weeks after the Hargrove trip and started calling it privately and without drama the way he looked at her. "What do you want?" he said. It was a real question. She could see that. He wasn't asking it rhetorically. "I want what I've got," she said. "The work and the mess and the books that don't balance right until I make them balance. The mare with the stone bruise. The broom with the missing bristles." She paused. "The man who noticed all of it." Colt was quiet for a long time. "I've got a broken leg," he said finally, "and a balloon payment due in the spring." "I know about the balloon payment," she said. "I've been working on that for 6 weeks. We have options." He stared at her. "What options?" "The 12 steers you sold before the blizzard, plus the Hargrove feed deal, improved the cash position by more than you might think. If you sell the grazing rights on the East Quarter for 1 season, not the land, just the rights, to the Morrison operation south of here, that covers the interest." If the spring cattle prices hold where they were last year, the calf sales will cover the principal. It's not comfortable, but it's manageable. She looked at him. I've run the numbers 4 different ways. All 4 of them work. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running it in his head independently, which she respected. He was a man who wanted to understand a thing, not just be told the conclusion of it. The Morrison grazing rights, he said, for the East Quarter only. 1 season. It keeps the North Pasture intact. Callaway can't touch the North Pasture. That's the point, she said. He let out a long breath. He reached across the table and picked up Raymond Hollis's letter and held it for a moment, and then set it back down in front of her. Go to Blackstone, he said. Send your reply. I will, she said. A pause. Evelyn, he said. Colt. He looked at his hands and then at her. In the lamplight, his face was as honest as she'd ever seen it, stripped of the caution he usually wore, the careful withholding of a man who had learned that showing too much left you with less. I would like you to stay, he said. Not because of the books, not because the food's better and the horses are healthier, though both those things are true. I'd like you to stay because this place has been— He stopped and started again. Because I have not been sorry for a single day since that morning you came and told me to go unload the lumber and you'd have coffee ready. She looked at him. 19 minutes, he said. I still think about that. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face shifted. What are you asking me? She said. He met her eyes. I'm asking if you'd consider staying, he said. Permanently, as my wife. I'm not offering money or comfort or what anybody else would call a proper life. I'm offering— He stopped again. The word he was looking for seemed to cost him something. Honesty, he said, and the work, and whatever this place becomes, and the fact that I see you. Not what I need from you or what I wanted when I was lonely. You. The woman who argued with Purvis about weevils and rode out in a blizzard because I was stupid enough to go after cattle alone in a storm. His voice had dropped slightly. That woman. I'd like her to stay. Evelyn Ashcroft sat with that for a moment. She had crossed half the country for a man who'd chosen her from a page, and then couldn't be bothered to stay long enough to meet her. She had stood on a train platform at 56 years old with $14 and a worn suitcase and a return ticket she hadn't wanted to use. She had come to this ranch on the decision of 4 minutes of conversation and the quality of one man's honesty, and she had built something here. Not romantic, not simple. Something harder and more durable than either of those things. You should know, she said, that I have opinions about how a kitchen should be organized. He looked at her. Strong ones, she said, and I will not stop telling you when the financial records are wrong just because it makes you uncomfortable. I know that, he said, and I think the east barn roof needs work before spring, or you'll have water damage in the hay, and I intend to say so until something is done about it. I believe you, he said. And, she said, and here she paused for just a moment, because she was 56 years old, and she was not a sentimental woman, but she was also, under the practicality that had been load-bearing in her life for decades, a human being who had wanted to be seen by someone for a very long time. I would like that too, to stay, as your wife. The kitchen was very quiet. Colt reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, just placed it there, warm and calloused and real, and left it. She turned her hand over and let his fingers close around it, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight with the winter settling quietly outside the windows. She went to Blackstone the next day. Toby drove her in the wagon, cheerful and chattering about the fence repair progress and the 2 missing cattle that had in fact turned up in the east shelter exactly where Denny had thought they might. And she listened to him and answered his questions and watched the winter-pale landscape moving past and thought about what she was doing. The telegraph office was next to the post office on Main Street. She went in and wrote her reply to Raymond Hollis's letter on the form the operator gave her. Not 3 pages, not careful considered prose. 12 words. Thank you for writing. My answer is no. I wish you well. She paid for it. She walked back out onto the boardwalk. The dry goods store across the street was where Purvis had called her the old bride 2 months ago. She could see him through the window, moving behind the counter with his loud, confident manner. and she watched him for a moment and then walked in. He saw her and his manner shifted. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The particular arrangement of confidence that he'd had in September had reorganized itself since the Weevil conversation. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. He'd started calling her that sometime in October without her correcting him, which she took as a small and bloodless victory. "Mr. Purvis," she said, "I need lamp oil, a sack of dried apples, and 2 pounds of coffee." She set her list on the counter. "The coffee from the back stock, not the front. The front's been sitting since fall." He looked at the list. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went to get it. While he was in the back, a woman she'd seen twice before in the store, Mrs. Calloway, she'd figured out, Gerald Calloway's wife, a thin woman with a precise manner who had always treated Evelyn with a cool politeness that was the nearest thing to neutral she'd experienced in Blackstone, came in and nodded to her. "Mrs. Ashcroft," she said. "Mrs. Calloway," Evelyn said. A pause. Mrs. Calloway arranged herself beside the counter with a small shopping basket and was quiet for a moment as though deciding something. Then she said quietly, "I heard about the accident." "The blizzard." "Mr. Brennan's recovering," Evelyn said. "I heard you rode out in it," she said, "to get help." "Toby rode for the doctor," Evelyn said. "I stayed with the patient." Mrs. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Her expression was the complex one of a woman who has been told one story about a person and has recently been receiving information that contradicts it. "Gerald is going to keep sending perch," she said, low enough that it was meant for Evelyn only. "I know that," Evelyn said. "I want you to know." She stopped. She started again, more carefully. "The North Pasture isn't going to happen for him. I've told him that. He doesn't listen to me about most things. But I wanted you to know I've said it." Evelyn looked at her. She was not a woman who'd had many allies in Blackstone, and this wasn't exactly an alliance. But it was something. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." Purvis came back with her supplies, and she paid and loaded the bag and walked back out to where Toby was waiting with the wagon. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said, and climbed up. On the way back, they passed the train station. She looked at the platform as they went by. The same weathered boards, the same bench where she'd sat with her suitcase, the same road leading away toward the horizon the afternoon train had disappeared into. Harold Briggs was outside doing something with a cart. He looked up and saw her and raised a hand, and she raised one back. The platform looked smaller than it had in September. The distances looked different now that she knew the land between here and the ranch, knew the road and the turns and the fence lines. The horizon was the same horizon, but it meant something different when you knew what was on the other side of it. Toby drove and talked about the cattle and the fence and whether he thought the winter would stay hard or ease in January, and she answered when he asked her things and let the rest of it settle around her. The cold air, the white landscape, the sound of the horses' hooves on the packed road, the smell of wood smoke from the chimneys they passed, and the smell of frost on the grass, and the smell of lamp oil from the bag at her feet. The ranch came into view around the long bend in the road, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney was rising straight up in the still, cold air, and the barn was there, and the fence line, and the white north pasture beyond it. And she looked at it all and thought, mine. Not legally, not yet, but in the way that mattered, the way a place becomes yours through the work you put into it and the decisions you make about it and the things you're willing to do to keep it standing. Colt was in the kitchen when she came in, working his way around the table on the crutches with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who has accepted that slow is currently the only speed available to him. He looked up when she came through the door. "How was town?" he said. "Cold," she said. "Purvis had the coffee from the back stock ready before I had to ask twice. I consider that progress." He watched her hang up her coat. "Did you send it?" "Yes," she said. He nodded. She went to the stove and checked the fire, which he'd managed to keep going, which she noted with approval. She got water on for supper and checked the pantry and came back to the kitchen and found him still standing with his crutches, watching her with that look. The named one. The one she'd stopped cataloging because she understood it now. "Colt," she said. "Evelyn. Sit down before you fall down. The crutches are making you sway." I'm not swaying, he said. You're swaying, she said. Sit. He sat. He put the crutches against the wall and settled into the chair and extended his right leg carefully and looked at her from across the kitchen with that expression, and she met it without evasion, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. The east barn roof, she said. I spoke to the lumber supplier in Blackstone. He can have what we need by the end of January. All right, he said, and I want to look at the windbreak posts more carefully when the ground softens enough to dig. I think it's worth resetting them deeper along the whole north line, not just where the section failed. That's expensive, he said. It's less expensive than another blizzard with cattle loose and someone under a wagon, she said. A pause. Fair point, he said. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was doing what it did in winter. Going fast. The pale sky darkening toward the blue-gray of early evening before 4 o'clock. The cattle in the south yard were moving toward the barn with their particular end-of-day unhurried deliberateness, and Denny's voice carried faintly on the cold air, directing them. She started supper. He sat at the table and watched her, which he'd been doing more openly lately, and she allowed it, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had said aloud yet, but which had been in the room between them for some time now. She was 56 years old, and she had come a long way to get here, by any measure. By miles and by decisions, and by the slow, difficult work of figuring out the difference between what she'd thought she wanted and what she actually needed. This wasn't what she'd imagined on the train. It was harder and colder and less certain, and the man watching her from across the kitchen would never be easy, and the work would never stop, and the money would be a problem again in the spring until it wasn't, and there would be other blizzards and other crises and probably more bad news arriving in letters. But she was here, and the fire was going, and the numbers in the ledger worked, and the man she'd said yes to was looking at her from across the kitchen with everything he felt written plainly on his face for once, unguarded and unperformed. She thought she could live with all of it. She thought she could live with it for a considerable time. They were married on a Thursday in February, which was not a romantic choice but a practical one. Thursday was the day Judge Alcott came through Blackstone on his circuit, and Colt's leg was still not reliable enough for the wagon ride to the county seat, and there was no reason to wait for better weather that might not come until April. Evelyn wore the blue wool coat she'd arrived in because it was the best thing she owned, and because she'd decided at some point in the week since the blizzard that she was done being embarrassed by what she had and didn't have. Colt wore his good shirt and his hat and his crutches, and he stood beside her in the Blackstone Courthouse anteroom, a plain room with 2 chairs and a window that looked onto Mill Street, and said what needed to be said in a clear voice without stumbling over any of it. Judge Alcott, who was 60-something and had married more frontier couples than he could count, and had long since stopped being surprised by anything the territory produced, looked at them both over his reading glasses when it was done. "Witnesses?" he said. Harold Briggs had come. Evelyn had sent him a note 3 days prior because he had been the first person to treat her with simple decency on the worst afternoon of her recent life, and she thought that deserved acknowledgement. He stood in the corner of the anteroom in his good coat, with his mustache neatened and his expression that of a man genuinely pleased to see a situation resolve well. Toby had come too, which she hadn't asked for, but which she hadn't been surprised by. He'd shown up at the wagon that morning when she and Colt were getting ready to leave and said he was coming and hadn't offered further explanation, and she hadn't asked for one. "Two?" Harold said, stepping forward. Toby stepped forward beside him with the solemn face of a young man taking a formal occasion very seriously. Judge Alcott had them sign and signed it himself and shook Colt's hand and nodded to Evelyn and put his papers back in his case. "Congratulations," he said, in the tone of a man who meant it, but had said it many times. He went on to his next appointment. Harold shook both their hands and said quietly to Evelyn, "I'm glad it worked out, ma'am." She thanked him and meant it. Toby looked like he was considering whether to hug someone and thought better of it and shook Colt's hand instead with great formality. They drove back to the ranch in the cold February afternoon, Evelyn and Colt on the wagon bench, and Toby riding behind on the gray. The road was clear, the sky a flat pewter that threatened snow but hadn't delivered it yet. Colt drove one-handed with his right hand and had his left on the bench between them, And at some point on the 6-mile road home, she put her hand over his without comment, and he turned his palm up and closed his fingers, and that was all. Denny had supper ready when they got back, which was unexpected and slightly alarming given what she knew of Denny's cooking abilities, but it was competent, and he'd made the effort, and she thanked him for it directly. "Didn't seem right for you to cook your own wedding supper," he said, looking at his plate. "It's very good, Denny," she said. He looked up. "The biscuits came out wrong." "The biscuits are fine," she said. "They're too dense," he said. "You didn't use enough lard," she said. "It's an easy fix." He nodded, filing it away, and went back to his supper. Toby, beside him, was eating the dense biscuits with the uncritical appetite of a 22-year-old who had been doing fence work in February cold all day. Colt, across from her, caught her eye over the table, and something in his expression said clearly that he was aware of the specific comedy of the situation. Married in a courthouse anteroom, wedding supper cooked by a ranch hand who couldn't get his biscuits right, celebrated with 2 employees, and a dense silence that was, in its own way, exactly right. She raised her coffee cup slightly. He raised his. That was the wedding. Winter finished itself in the slow, stubborn way winters did in that territory, releasing its grip reluctantly, degree by degree, the snow retreating from the south slopes first, and then the flats, and then, last of all, the north-facing ridgeline where it clung until late March, as though making a point. Colt was off the crutches by the middle of February, which was earlier than Dr. Marsh had recommended, and later than Colt had wanted. He walked with a slight drag on the right side for another 3 weeks after that, which he didn't acknowledge and she didn't comment on. What she did do, quietly and without announcement, was manage the terrain of the ranch so that the work most critical to do first was the work he could do without the right leg being fully operational. She adjusted the order of fence repairs so the sections closest to the house came first. She arranged the hay supply so that what needed moving could be moved from the near barn rather than the east one, which required a longer walk across uneven ground. She shifted the cattle rotation slightly to keep the animals he needed to work with accessible from the yard. He figured out what she was doing somewhere around the 3rd week. He came in for the midday meal and sat down and looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite the named one and wasn't quite irritation either. "The Morrison grazing rights arrangement," he said. "Yes," she said. "You talked to Morrison already." 2 weeks ago," she said, "before the wedding. I sent a letter." "Without telling me." "I told you I was working on the spring financing," she said. "I didn't itemize every step." He was quiet for a moment, and he agreed. He agreed to a preliminary conversation. "You'll need to ride out there when the road dries. It should be your conversation to close." She put the bread on the table. "I just opened the door." He looked at her. "You always do that," he said. "Do what?" "Get the thing to the point where it can be finished and then step back so it looks like I finished it." She sat down. "You did finish it. I arranged the conversation. You'll close the deal. Those are both real things." "I know they're both real things," he said. "I'm not complaining." "You sound like you might be complaining." "I'm not," he said. He stopped. He picked up his fork. "I'm trying to say thank you. I'm not good at it." "I know," she said. "Eat your lunch." He ate his lunch. The Morrison deal closed in early April, a handshake agreement for 1 season's grazing rights on the East Quarter for a figure that covered the bank interest, with enough left over to restock the salt block supply and put new hinges on the barn doors that had been working loose since November. Evelyn recorded it in the ledger and then looked at the full picture the ledger made: the debt position, the revenue projections based on the spring cattle prices, the feed costs reduced by the Hargrove bulk arrangement. And for the first time since she'd opened the battered book on her first night at the ranch, the numbers on the right side were clearly larger than the numbers on the left. She didn't make anything of it. She closed the ledger and started supper. But later that evening, when Colt was at the table going over the week's work plan with Denny, she refilled his coffee without being asked, and she let her hand rest briefly on his shoulder as she set the cup down. A small gesture, not performed for anyone, just the simple acknowledgement of a moment that deserved acknowledging. He put his hand over hers for a second, the way he'd done on the wagon bench coming back from the courthouse. Then she moved back to the stove and he went back to the work plan, and that was sufficient. Spring arrived the way it always did in that territory. Not gently, but decisively. One week the ground was frozen and the mornings were dark and the wind had teeth, and then something shifted, the angle of the light changed, and the grass began coming back. First pale and thin and then with increasing conviction, and the cattle moved differently in the pastures, more settled, less restless, responding to the return of good grazing the way they always did. The blizzard had been hard on the herd. Not catastrophically, but the weight loss over winter showed, and the 2 steers they'd sold before the storm would have been useful now if they'd kept them. It was the right decision still, Evelyn believed, because the cash had been necessary at the time, but she made a note to herself about the ideal herd size for this operation heading into winter and what they'd need to sell and when to avoid the same pressure next year. She'd started thinking in seasons that way, not just the current problem, but the 1-2 seasons ahead, the decision you made in October affecting what was possible in April. It was the same skill she'd used for 11 years keeping books in Ohio, the same forward calculation, just applied to different inputs. She was good at it. She'd always been good at it. What she hadn't had in Ohio was anything she cared enough about to apply it to with full effort. Colt rode out to the north pasture on a morning in early May, the first time he'd gone that far on horseback since the blizzard, and she watched him go from the kitchen window with the feeling of a held breath being released. He came back 2 hours later and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "The windbreak posts are soft on the south end, 3 of them." "I know," she said. "I flagged it in March. We need to reset them before next fall." "We need to reset all of them," she said. "I told you that in January." He leaned in the doorway. "You did," he said. "I want you to know I didn't forget it. I just needed to see it myself." She understood that. She didn't hold it against him. Men who'd worked land for decades needed to read it with their own eyes, not from a piece of paper, and there was wisdom in that even if it occasionally slowed things down. "I'll price the labor," she said. "We can't do all of it with just Denny and Toby. We'll need to hire day workers for a week, maybe 2. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "Good," she said. "We agree." He almost smiled. "We don't always." "No," she said. "We don't. But we do on this." They went to Blackstone in late May for the spring livestock market, a 2-day event that brought ranchers from across the territory into town to buy and sell and exchange information about prices and weather and which operations were struggling and which were doing well. Evelyn had never attended it before. It had always happened while she was managing the ranch end of things, while Colt handled the market end. This time she came. She had her reasons, which she had not fully explained to Colt, but which he had not pressed her on, because by now he'd learned that when she had a reason for something, she'd share it when it was relevant, and not before. The Blackstone Spring Market was held in the yards behind the livery and in the street in front of it, and it was loud and crowded and smelled of cattle and horses and too many men in too small a space. She stood beside Colt at the edge of the buying ring and watched the proceedings and noted which ranchers were buying aggressively, a sign of confidence in their own financial position, and which were selling more than they were buying, which told a different story. Gerald Calloway was buying aggressively. She watched him for a while. He was a large man with the specific confidence of someone who had been the most significant landowner in an area for long enough to have confused wealth with importance. He moved through the market with his foreman Perch, a step behind him, and he bought 3 lots of young steers and a breeding bull at prices that were slightly high, which meant he wasn't being patient and he wasn't feeling financial pressure. She also noticed that he bought the Henderson cattle. The Henderson operation, D. Henderson, who had owed Colt money for 8 weeks and been collected from and then sold to Calloway, apparently, was represented by Henderson himself, a thin, nervous man who didn't look at Calloway directly while they talked. She watched the transaction from across the yard and ran the arithmetic on the prices in her head and understood something she hadn't understood before. She went and found Harold Briggs, who was at the market in his capacity as the Territorial Postal Authority, an occasional informal record keeper for public transactions. "Henderson's land," she said. "Did it sell?" Harold looked at her. "You didn't hear?" "I've been at the ranch," she said. "February," he said low. "Sold to the Calloway Land Company. Henderson said he needed the liquidity." She looked back across the yard at Calloway and Henderson. "What did he get for it?" Harold told her. She kept her face neutral. "That's low," she said. "Considerably low for that acreage." "It is," Harold agreed. "People said so at the time. Henderson said he needed the cash quickly, and Calloway was the only buyer who moved fast enough." She thanked Harold and went back to find Colt. He was concluding a sale, 4 yearling steers to an operation from the northern end of the territory, a clean transaction at a good price. He saw her face when he looked up. "What?" he said. "Not here," she said. "Later." He sold 2 more lots and bought nothing, which was the right call. Their herd needed to build, not reduce further, and the prices for good young cattle were higher than they wanted to pay. They had lunch at this Cattleman's Rest, which was the working-class hotel where Harold had directed Evelyn on her first afternoon in Blackstone, and she told him what she'd learned about Henderson. He listened to it all without interrupting. "Calloway moved on Henderson the same way he's been moving on us," she said. "He waits for a financial pressure point, and then he offers fast money at a low price, and the person takes it because they don't have another option that moves quickly enough." Colt turned his coffee cup. "Henderson's land was east of ours," he said. "He's got the Henderson parcel now, and he's been buying on the ridge. He's building toward something." "Yes," she said. "The north pasture is the gap in what he's assembling," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "For a while," she said. "I wanted to be sure of the picture before I said anything." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the hotel dining room was busy with ranchers and their wives and the particular noise of people conducting business over food. "What do you want to do about it?" he said. "I want to talk to the Territorial Land Office," she said, "about the deed records on the parcels Calloway's been acquiring. Some of those transactions happened fast and at unusual prices. I want to understand whether they were all voluntary." He looked at her steadily. "That's a serious accusation to be considering." "I'm not making an accusation," she said. "I want to look at records. Records are public. I'm entitled to look at them. And if you find something, then we'll know something," she said. "And knowing something is better than not knowing it." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" "A day in the county seat," she said. "And the wagon." He gave her both. She spent 2 days at the county seat, not one, because the land records were not organized the way she would have organized them, and locating the relevant deed transfers required more time than she'd estimated. She was not impatient about this. She worked through the files with the methodical persistence she'd developed over 11 years of finding the discrepancy that other people had missed or decided wasn't worth the effort of finding. She found 3 things worth finding. The first was that 4 of the parcels Calloway had acquired in the past 2 years had transferred at prices more than 30% below the assessed land value. All within 60 days of each transaction, the sellers had taken out short-term loans from a private lender, not the Blackstone Territorial Bank, but a separate entity whose principal was listed in the filing documents as a holding company out of Denver. The second was that the holding company's registered agent in the Denver filing was the same law firm that had handled the original sale of the Anchor H Ranch, Raymond Hollis's ranch, the one he'd sold before disappearing. The third was a name that appeared in the notarial records on 3 of the deed transfers as the witnessing notary, a man named Clifton Purvis, who was, as far as she was aware, a dry goods merchant with no particular legal qualification. She sat with these 3 things for a long time in the county records room, looking at the documents spread before her, and thought carefully about what they meant and what they didn't mean, and what the difference between a pattern and proof was. Then she made copies of everything in her neat, compact hand, paid the clerk's fee for the certified copies she requested of the key documents, and drove home. She told Colt that night. She laid the copies on the kitchen table in the order she'd found them and walked him through the chain of it: the loans, the company, the law firm, the notary. He was quiet for a very long time when she was done. "Purvis," he said finally. "He's Calloway's man." "He appears to be," she said. "The notarizations may be legitimate. I don't know enough about the legal requirements to say otherwise. But his presence on 3 of the 4 documents isn't coincidence. And the Denver company, I've written to a legal contact in Denver," she said. "My daughter's husband practices commercial law. I've sent him copies and asked for his assessment, I should hear back within 2 weeks. Colt looked at her. Your daughter's husband. He's a good lawyer, she said. I've met him twice. He's thorough. You sent documents to your family. My son-in-law, she said. Who practices law? Yes. She paused. I wrote to my daughter at the same time. We've been corresponding again since January. She looked at the table. I should have mentioned that. He was quiet for a moment. How is she? Well, she said. She has questions about the situation here. I've been answering them. What does she think? Evelyn considered how to answer that honestly. She thinks I've made a decision she wouldn't have made, she said. She also thinks I seem more settled than I've been in years. She said both those things in the same letter, which I thought was fair. Colt looked at the table with the document spread across it. When did you become someone who knew lawyers in Denver? He said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to it. I became someone who married into access to a lawyer in Denver, she said, which is a different thing, but useful. The letter from her son-in-law, Thomas, arrived 12 days later. It was precise and thorough in the way Thomas's communications always were, and it confirmed what she'd suspected. The Denver holding company was a shell entity with no independent assets or operations, whose practical function was to provide a buffer between the private lender and the transactions it was facilitating. The law firm that had handled the Anchor H sale was under investigation by the Denver Bar Association for 2 separate complaints, unrelated to this territory, involving real estate transactions with irregular notarization. He stopped short of calling it fraud because he hadn't seen all the records, but he used the word irregular 4 times in 2 pages, which told her what he thought. She took the letter and her copies to Harold Briggs. She chose Harold because he was the most connected, honest person she knew in Blackstone, and because he had the kind of institutional credibility, as a federal postal authority, that would make a territorial land commissioner take a meeting. She explained what she had and what she thought it showed and what she thought needed to happen next. Harold read everything twice. He looked at her over the top of the last page. This is going to make some people very uncomfortable, he said. Yes, she said, it is. Calloway has relationships with people in this territory, he said. Significant ones. I know that, she said. I'm not suggesting anything illegal was done by those people. I'm suggesting the land records show a pattern that the territorial commissioner should be aware of and should investigate properly. She met his eyes. I'm not the authority here. I'm a woman who knows how to read financial records. The people with authority need to look at this. Harold looked at the documents again. He looked at her again. You're not worried about the blowback, he said. It was almost an observation, not quite a question. I've been called the old bride by a dry goods merchant in front of a room full of people, she said. I think I can manage blowback. Harold Briggs made an appointment with the territorial land commissioner. What followed was not swift or dramatic or clean. These things never were. The commissioner's office requested the original certified copies. There was a formal inquiry which took 6 weeks and generated enough paperwork that she suspected the intention was partly to exhaust whoever had raised the concern. Calloway sent Perch to the ranch twice during this period, and both times Evelyn answered the door, and both times she said pleasantly that any matters related to the North Pasture or the Brennan operations finances should be directed to the Territorial Commissioner's Office, which was currently reviewing the land records for this district. Perch's expression, the second time, told her that message had landed. The inquiry found what she'd found, and more that she hadn't. 2 additional parcels with the same loan and lowball pattern, and a formal letter from the Denver Bar Association confirming the law firm's disciplinary history. The private lender was identified and ordered to produce documentation of its loan terms. 2 of the 4 sellers who had transferred land below assessed value filed formal complaints. Calloway himself was not charged with anything. The structure of it, the shell company, the arm's-length relationship with the lender, the intermediary law firm, had been assembled precisely to prevent that. But the Denver company's operating status was suspended pending investigation, which meant the financing mechanism that had been powering his acquisitions was frozen. And 3 of the parcels he'd acquired in the past 2 years were under deed review, which meant he couldn't sell or subdivide them. He stopped sending Perch to the ranch. Purvis, the notary question, turned out to be less dramatic than it had looked. He held a notarial commission he'd obtained years earlier for his business, and while his involvement in the deed transfers was irregular in appearance, it was technically within his authority. He was not charged with anything, but he stopped calling Evelyn Mrs. Ashcroft, which she noted, and started calling her Mrs. Brennan, which she found she preferred. The North pasture stayed in the family name. By the time summer was fully established, grass green and long in the valley below the ridge, the creek running clear, the cattle moving with the weight they'd put back on since the hard winter, the Brennan Ranch was in the strongest position it had been in for years. The calf sales in June came in at a price that cleared the remaining bank debt with enough left over that Colt was able to hire the day workers for the windbreak post resetting without borrowing anything from anyone. She was in the yard one morning in late June, watching the hired workers set the new posts along the north fence line, when Colt came out of the barn and stood beside her. They watched in silence for a while. "The south section's going to need a second crew," he said. "I know," she said. "I've got them coming Thursday." He looked at the fence line. "The Morrison grazing arrangement worked out well for them too," he said. "Morrison told me he's interested in doing it again next year." "I expected that," she said. "His east pasture is overgrazed. He needs the rotation." "I told him we'd consider it," he said. "I told him my wife would need to look at the numbers first." She glanced at him. He was looking at the fence with a straight face. "That's the first time you've called me your wife to another person," she said. "I know," he said. Morrison looked like it surprised him. "I imagine it did," she said. "He recovered quickly," Colt said. "He said you'd reorganize 3 other operations financial records in the territory and people were talking about it." She looked at the fence. "People in this territory talk about everything," she said. "They do," he agreed. "They're also calling you the woman who stopped Calloway." "I didn't stop Calloway," she said. "I found the records. The commissioner's office stopped Calloway. Harold Briggs made the appointment. Thomas wrote the legal analysis. It was a collective effort." "You were the beginning of it," he said. "I was the one who read the documents," she said. "That's all." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not all," he said. "But I know you won't accept more than that, so I'll leave it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was coming in over the eastern ridge at the angle it came in at in late June, long and gold and different from any other month's light, and it was warm and the grass was long, and the posts were going in solid and deep along the north fence line. "Colt," she said. "Evelyn." "I want to go back to the station," she said. "Blackstone." "There's a livestock shipment coming in on Friday." "I know," he said. "I was planning to go." "I want to go with you," she said. He looked at her. She'd been to Blackstone many times since her arrival, but she hadn't been back to the train station itself, had arranged to avoid it without quite acknowledging she was doing so. He hadn't mentioned it. "All right," he said. "Friday." They went on Friday in the wagon, arriving mid-morning when the eastbound freight was due. The platform was busy. Freight handlers, a few passengers, the usual cluster of people conducting the business that accumulated around a station. Harold Briggs was there. 2 men she recognized from the spring market. Purvis, crossing the street on some errand, who saw them and nodded. She stood on the platform where she had stood in September, 9 months ago, with her single suitcase and $14 and a return ticket she hadn't wanted to use. The bench was there. The bench she'd sat on when Harold Briggs had told her Raymond Hollis was gone. The road she'd watched for an arriving wagon that hadn't come. She stood there and looked at it all. Colt was beside her, close but not touching, giving her whatever this was. It looked smaller than it had in September. The whole station did. She remembered how enormous the horizon had seemed that afternoon, how exposed, how final, how far from everything familiar. She looked at the same horizon now, and it was just the horizon. She knew the land between here and the ranch. She knew the road and the turns and the line of fence that marked the northern boundary of what was theirs. Something had happened between that September afternoon and this June morning that was not, she thought, primarily about falling in love or finding a home, or any of the large things people said about large changes. Those things had happened too. But underneath them was something more specific and more difficult to name. She had stopped waiting for her circumstances to become what she deserved and had started building them into it. That was not a wisdom she'd arrived with. She'd thought she had it. She'd thought the train ticket west was an act of building rather than waiting. But standing on this platform in September, she'd understood for the first time the difference. Waiting was hoping someone else's decision would save you. Building was making the decision yourself, even when you didn't know if it would work. She had built something here, imperfectly, incrementally, out of a broom with missing bristles and a ledger that didn't balance, and a stone bruise on a mare's hoof, and the particular stubbornness required to ride out into a blizzard, because the alternative was worse. Not heroic, not clean, just the accumulated weight of daily decisions made in the direction of what mattered. The freight train came in on time, which was unusual and noted by the platform workers with mild surprise. The livestock car was second from the rear, and the handlers started moving the animals. 4 young breeding heifers Colt had arranged to purchase from a northern operation, good bloodlines, the beginning of improving the herd's genetics in a way that would pay out over years, not months. She watched them come off the car. She assessed them the way she'd learned to assess livestock over 9 months of watching Colt do it, looking at the condition of their coat, the way they moved, the conformation of their structure. "Third one favors her right front," she said. Colt looked. "She does," he said. "Stone bruise, maybe, or a travel injury from the car." "Have the handler walk her again before we load her," she said. He signaled the handler. They walked the heifer. She watched. "She's sound," Colt said. "The stride straightens out after the first few steps. She was just stiff from the car." "All right," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face was doing the named thing, the way he looked at her. But it had more in it now than it had in October or December, because things accumulate. And what he looked at her with was 9 months of accumulated daily knowing. "You've gotten good at that," he said. "I had a good teacher," she said. "You had a stubborn self," he said. "I just had the cattle." She didn't argue the point. She watched the handlers load the heifers into the wagon and thought about the north pasture in 3 years, when those animals would have calves of their own walking the same grass, and the fence line that would be properly set by then, and the ledger that would show a different picture than it had shown in October. Raymond Hollis had stood somewhere in this territory, she supposed, and looked at a ranch and found it wanting. She had stood on this platform 9 months ago and been left behind by a man who had decided, at the last moment, or perhaps long before it, that she was not worth staying for. These were the facts of it. They didn't need softening. What she had learned, not easily, not without cost, was that being left behind was not the same as being without worth. It had felt like the same thing on that September afternoon. She'd been wrong. The two things were entirely separate, and the work of separating them had been the hardest work she'd done in 9 months, harder than the blizzard ride and the frozen pump handle and the balloon payment arithmetic. It was quiet work, internal, the kind that left no record in a ledger. But it was done. She knew who she was, and she knew what she'd built, and she stood on the Blackstone platform in the June morning light with the full confidence of someone who had answered the only question that mattered. Not what does the world think I deserve, but what am I willing to make from what I have? The heifers were loaded. The handlers closed the wagon gate. Harold Briggs came over and exchanged a few words with Colt about the new road commission meeting and the state of the Eastern Bridge, and then nodded to Evelyn with the warmth of a man who considered himself rightly part of the story. She looked back at the platform once before she climbed up to the wagon bench. The bench? The road. The horizon. Then she climbed up. Colt handed her the reins for a moment while he settled, which he'd started doing recently, handing her the reins while he got situated, a small transfer of practical trust. She held them and felt the living weight of the horses through them, and thought about the mare Clover, whose hoof had healed completely and who had become, quietly, her horse, in the way that animals attach themselves to the people who paid them careful attention. She gave the reins back to Colt. He clicked to the horses, and they moved off the station road and onto the main street, and then north, out of town, the wagon wheels finding the familiar ruts of the road they had driven together more times than she could count now. The ranch was 6 miles away. She knew every turn. Beside her, Colt drove with his easy, practiced hand, and after a mile he said, without preamble or sentiment, the way he said most things, "Good heifers." "Yes," she said, "they'll do well in the north pasture." "That's what I thought," he said. The road opened up ahead of them, and the land on either side was green with the full arrival of summer, and the mountains to the northwest were clear in the morning air, their upper elevation still showing white that would be gone by August. She looked at all of it without the searching quality she'd had when she first came, not looking for rescue or possibility or a life different from the one she'd had. Just looking, taking in what was there. There is a particular kind of freedom in that, in the shift from hoping a place will save you to simply inhabiting it. Most people spend a great deal of their lives in the first condition without recognizing it. Evelyn had spent 55 years of hers there. She didn't begrudge the 55 years. They had made her the woman who could read a ledger in lamplight and ride out in a blizzard and find 3 things worth finding in a county records room. None of that came from ease. But the 56th year, and the beginning of the 57th, had given her something the first 55 hadn't quite managed. Not happiness as a destination, something steadier than that. The willingness to be exactly where she was, doing exactly what was required, with the person who had looked at her clearly from the first moment and found her worth looking at. That was enough. It was, she had discovered, considerably more than enough. The ranch came into view around the long bend in the road, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney where Denny had gotten the fire going before they left. The barn solid against the morning sky. The new fence posts pale and bright along the north line where the older ones had been reset. She looked at it the way she'd looked at it that first morning when Colt had stopped the wagon in the yard and said, "This is it." But different. Not the look of someone assessing what they'd gotten themselves into. The look of someone coming home. Colt turned the wagon into the yard and stopped and looked at her. "All right?" he said. It was a simple question. She gave it a simple answer. "Yes," she said. "All right." She climbed down from the wagon and went to open the barn door, and the heifers in the wagon bed shifted and settled, and somewhere in the north pasture the cattle were moving through the long summer grass, and the day was waiting with everything it required. She went to meet it,